to the wife. Now, another reason, we say these words just may mean nothing is not because we want to dismiss their relevance, but because men, sometimes we want to dismiss our responsibility. My wife and I have friends, and he works in a job which allows him to travel whenever he wants. That's because his job takes him to assignments that will be very lengthy in distant parts of the world. So because he will be gone and distant for so long, his company lets him determine when he'll go. But he does not consult his wife about that. In fact, his wife came to mind a few years ago and said this: "My husband goes for sometimes months at a time. He does not ask me when he can go, when he should go, what effect it will have on our family. He does not tell us when he's coming home. He makes plans about going again without involving me. What my husband does is he simply breaks into the routine of the children and I every few weeks or months, then goes again, and he's completely responsible to himself." She said, "I don't have 3 kids. I have 4. How do we know that's not biblical headship? Because of the way in which Christ is never allowing headship simply to mean taking advantage of other people. Now, as Christ begins to define headship here, look at verse 25. "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, gave himself up for her." There's an activity being described. There's actions for the sake of others. "To make her holy," verse 26, "cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other." There's this activity of being the head of the church. And the reason I'm stressing activity is because so often, even in Christian circles where headship is described as "me Tarzan, you doormat," that what it really is an excuse for passivity among males. I mention the issue of passivity because while our culture is concerned about headship roles because of fear of male dominance, in counseling, often when I'm dealing with Christian wives, they are much more concerned about male passivity than they are about male dominance. People who are using the headship role to excuse themselves responsibility. That kind of say, this means nothing. But I'm the head, I don't have responsibility anymore. But what Christ is showing us is headship is something active. It is concerned, sacrificial, working for the good of another. Even where there are abusive homes, and you will find soon as a pastor that there are abusive homes in all of our churches. Even where there are abusive homes, you will find that passivity is a problem because of the pattern that typically follows. Here's what happens. A man, under the excuse of headship, becomes self-contained, self-absorbed, and non-responsive to the needs of his family. And then a wife who is typically more verbally oriented begins to needle, to try to move him, to try to change him, begins verbally to try to move him along to more responsiveness. And what the husband does is he just takes it for a long time passively until the cup of impatience grows full, and then he explodes, only to return to the pattern of passivity again afterwards. Being the head of a home does not mean nothing. What does it mean? It is at least an expression of authority. We just can't avoid that. If you go to verse 21, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." Now, you and I both recognize this is controversial in itself because of verse 21 that just preceded, where it said, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ," and then suddenly, having done this equal, even Stephen kind of statement, we get, "Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord." It's like some sort of strange statement out of Orwell's Animal Farm, All animals are equal, only some are more equal than others, Everyone's to submit, although some are to submit more than others. Is that what it means? It certainly means that wives are to submit to their husbands because God is giving authority to husbands. I don't know how you will explain it in your own mind to say that Christ is the head of the church. But in whatever way that you think that Christ is the head of the church, the Bible is clearly saying that authority is being given to men in the home The husband is the head of the wife. Verse 23. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. And to make the point, there then follows an imperative. Verse 24. As the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit. On the analogy of the church and Christ, and then with the extension of that analogy in ways that we can hardly even fathom. So also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. It's just not avoidable that there is an expression of authority that Christian men should not dismiss themselves from. Even in Christian circles, there is sometimes the sense that it's just even Steven, that fairness requires that somebody washes the dishes as much as the other, somebody holds the remote as much as the other, somebody cooks as much. And listen, that's really not the issue the apostle's talking about. He is saying, however, somebody is responsible for the spiritual leadership of the home. And that headship is assigned to the husband. Because the wife is to submit to the husband as the church submits to Christ, her head. Now, it's not just an expression of authority, this headship. It is also an expression of service. You know that. Going down to verse 25. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Let me tell you the issue of the passage. Most of you know it because you're studying it in the epistles anyway. It's what you do with verse 21. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Having that overarching statement of mutual submission, now the apostle begins to deal with three different pairs of individuals. Who are they? Husbands and wives. What comes next? Children and parents. Next. Slaves and masters. Now, the strangeness for those who study it well, and yet the precision with which the apostle is speaking is very important. Because having said, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ, he never then says to that person who is in authority in that culture, you are to submit, that wording is not used, you are to submit to the one who is in that society viewed as being subservient to you. You have to be clear about that. The apostle never says, husbands, submit to your wives. He never says, parents, submit to your children. He never says, masters, submit to your slaves. Now, in that regard, the culture of Paul's time would be perfectly comfortable with this passage. Those who are in charge, stay in charge. No problem. But of course, that's not the end of what the apostle says. He doesn't tell those who are in charge to submit. He tells them to sacrifice. He does not take away their authority. He tells them to use their authority for the sake of another. That is the radical nature of the gospel come into play as it deals with families. Paul never says to parents, you don't have authority over your children anymore. He says, use your authority for their sake. He even will say to masters, treat your slaves as your brother. Sacrifice your good for their interest. It's not so much that verse 21 is the headline verse of the whole passage. You'd have to go back to verse 1 of chapter 5. Be imitators of God as dearly loved children and live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. What did the head of the church do? He gave himself up for us. It was for our sake that he gave and used his authority to bring the world and Satan into submission. He used his authority for the sake of others. What we're being told is that we as Christian husbands are servant leaders. And you say, well, what does that mean? Certainly very hard for our society to understand. But if anyone understands, It ought to be us, believers, because